Everyone, to the 10-Minute University Noontime Chat. Today's talk is an introduction to growing berries. If you're wanting to put in some type of berry, I hope that the information that I'm going to give you today will help you decide which type of berry will be best for you and your home garden. Today's class is a 10-Minute University presentation offered in collaboration with and in support of OSU Extension Service Master Gardener Program. Here's a list of some of the 10-Minute University handouts that you will find if you can go to cmastergardeners.org. These publications will give you information on some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. And we have even more publications. These are Oregon State University Extension publications. These publications will give you in-depth information on growing these berries in your home garden. And you can find these online at the OSU Extension catalog. I'm going to be referring to these publications quite a bit during today's presentation. So here are our objectives. I'm hoping to help you decide which berries, and I'm going to talk about blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries, which ones will work best for you. You're going to learn about the longevity, the spacing requirements, the fruiting season, different varieties, the production, some diseases and pests, and how to do weeding, fertilizing, and pruning. I'm also going to cover some of the most frequently asked questions that I get when people ask me about berries. So I'm going to start by talking about longevity of these berries to give you a better idea of the time and effort that it will take for the specific berries. Blueberries are very long-lived plants, 50 years or more, depending on the type of blueberry that you plant, the soil, the pest pressure, and the pruning practices. They are the longest living of all the berries that I'm going to talk about today. Blackberry plants have a lifespan of between 15 to 40 years, and that depends on the presence of pests and adverse environmental conditions. Now, your red and yellow raspberry plants have a little bit shorter lifespan, usually anywhere from 10 to 15 years. But I do know people that have had some of their raspberry plants for upwards of 30 years. So maybe you'll be one of those lucky ones. While black raspberry plants do not live as long as the red and yellow raspberries, they will live for about 5 to 10 years. And once again, just like the blackberries, it's depending on the presence of pests or adverse environmental conditions. Now, strawberry plantings are only productive for about 3 to 5 years, but with careful site selection, you can maximize the quality and the quantity of your fruit from your plants during that time. All right, if you're concerned about the amount of space needed to grow a berry crop, these next few slides, I'm hoping, will give you that information. Some people have more room, some people have less room. So let's see what you think will work best for your situation. Okay, for blueberries, if you're planting a blueberry in the ground, one bush will need about a 4-foot square area. And if you put them in a row, you're going to want to plant them about 3 to 4 feet apart. So think about that. That will give you an idea of about how much space you're going to need if you're going to be putting in blueberries. Now, blueberries can be planted in a container. And if you are going to plant a northern highbush blueberry, you would need to put it in a container that's about the size of a half a whiskey barrel or a 15 to 20 gallon container. We also have another type of blueberry that does really well in containers, and those are called half highs. That's a cross between a northern high bush and a low bush. And for those, a 10 gallon or larger container would be a good enough spacing for that blueberry. There are also, this is the planting space for trailing blackberries. There are also erect and semi-erect blackberries available, and they grow a little different than the trailing blackberries. But for this talk today, I'm only going to address the trailing varieties. But the publications that I mentioned do have information on the other two types of berries. Not as many people grow erect or semi-erect blackberries, but they are getting more popular. So if you are interested in those, I would really suggest that you look up the publication of growing blackberries in your home garden. So for the trailing blackberries, you're going to want to plant them 3 to 5 feet apart in a row, and you're going to want the row to be about 2 to 3 feet wide. Now for raspberries, there's a couple different kinds of raspberries. So for your summer-bearing raspberries, the information says to plant them about 2.5 feet apart and in a row about 12 to 18 inches wide. Now, even though you're planting them 2.5 feet apart, remember, raspberries grow from the roots. So they are going to definitely fill in that space over time. And over the years, you're going to get more and more raspberries coming up. So they're not going to stay just 2.5 feet apart. Now, blackberries, like I mentioned, they grow just from the crown. So they will stay where you plant them, but the raspberries will spread out. Then we have everbearing, sometimes called fall-bearing and also called primocane-bearing raspberries. We suggest that you plant them about 2 feet apart in a row about 12 to 18 inches wide. Now, June bearers are planted in what we call a hill system, 15 inches apart in the row and the width of the row about 12 to 18 inches. And that is the reason we call it a hill system is you plant them together and then they set out runners, and these runners, maybe I better start from the beginning. When you plant it in the ground, we call that the mother plant. And then they send out runners. And when these runners produce new plants, we call those the daughter plants. So even though you're planting your strawberries 15 inches apart, as the season goes on, they will put out runners, they will put out baby plants, daughter plants, and these will become new plants again for production the next year. The other kind of strawberry we want to talk about is day neutral. And if you're planting them in the ground, they suggest that you plant them on what is called a matted row system. So 1.5 to 2 feet wide row. You're still going to set the plants 12 to 15 inches apart, but you're going to stagger these 2 or 3 lines of the plants down the row. And the reason for that is that day neutral plants do not put out runners, and if they do, you're going to cut those runners off. You do not want that mother plant to put out daughter plants because day neutrals grow all season long. You want that mother plant to only be producing strawberries and not be producing daughters. Now, day neutrals do really well in containers, and it's suggested that you put about 4 plants in a 12-inch container. So that'll give you an idea if you have a larger container or a smaller container about how many day neutral plants you're going to need. It's important to know when you can expect to harvest your berries. You want to be sure that you're going to be home around that time so that you can actually enjoy them. There are different varieties of blueberries, and they can be harvested depending on the variety. You could be having berries from late June to mid-September. Raspberries, depending again on the variety and whether you have the summer bearing or you have the fall bearing, anywhere from June, July, and August to frost. Blackberries, again, depending on the variety, from mid-June to early September. And strawberries, once again, depending on the variety, June through fall. Okay. Now, not only are you going to want to decide which type of berries you want to grow, but you're also going to have to decide which variety is best for you in your home garden. There are many varieties of blueberries that do well in the Pacific Northwest. Now, Northern Highbush is one of the most widely used ones here. Oregon State University has a really good publication called Blueberry Cultivars for the Pacific Northwest. This publication will give you lots of specific information about each variety. The ones that I have listed here on the slide are just a few of the varieties that are available. This publication will give you information such as the berry size, the bush size, the disease resistance, and a lot more information. So if you're planning on planting blueberries, I would suggest that you look up this publication and go through it and find out all the information that you're going to need about which berry you want to have. Now, half-high blueberries, which I mentioned before, is another type that we see grown a lot in containers and also for ornamental because they have really beautiful fall color. The cultivar publication that I just talked about will give you information on this and other types of blueberries. And once again, I have just a short list here. There's many, many more varieties out there. This is just a short list of what's available. And of course, Oregon State University also has another great publication for raspberries, raspberry cultivars for the Pacific Northwest. And once again, this is just a short list that I have here. There are many, many more varieties listed, and there is so much good information out there about what the specific variety is all about. And along with summer bearing raspberries, there's also a list of fall bearing. Sometimes, once again, sometimes people call them ever bearing, or sometimes we call them primocane bearing. And they also include the fall bearing yellow raspberries. So I mentioned at the beginning that I was going to refer to a lot of the OSU publications. That is such good information, and they've all been updated in 2020. So you know the information in these publications are definitely up to date. Now, there's also another type of raspberry called Blackcaps. This is the only slide that I'm going to use to talk about these because not very many homeowners grow these in their home garden. Now, some of you may say, I grow them and I love them. And yes, if you are interested in growing black raspberries or Blackcaps, the information that I mentioned in that blueberry cultivar, or the raspberry cultivar, that they do have a lot of information about that. But not very many homeowners do grow them. They have a very distinct flavor, and either you like them or you don't like them. That's what I've heard people tell me. They don't grow as a vine like regular strawberries. They grow more in a shrub shape, and they do require quite a bit of summer pruning in order to get the berries that you want on them. Now, here's a list of the most popular varieties of trailing blackberries that are grown in our area. You probably recognize some of these names, like Marion, Obsidian, Thornless, Evergreen. These are a cross between blackberry and a blackberry. The boysenberry, loganberry, and tayberry, that is a cross between a blackberry and a raspberry. But we don't call those raspberries. And the reason is, if I asked you and said, do you know why? A lot of you, I'm sure, are saying, I know why they're called a blackberry instead of a raspberry. Well, for those of you that don't know, it's because when you pull a blackberry off of the vine, the receptacle stays inside of that blackberry, and that's part of that you eat. When you pull a raspberry off of a vine, the receptacle stays on the bush and not on the berry. So even though boysen, logan, and tayberries are half raspberry, half blackberry, the receptacle will stay inside, and we call those blackberries. And of course, OSU has another publication for strawberry cultivars for Western Oregon and Washington. And once again, this is just a very short list that I have put on this slide. There are many, many more types of varieties out there for both the summer bearing and for the day neutral too. Now, there are not as many day neutral varieties available as there are the summer varieties. So I want you to be aware that when you go to the farm or nursery store, you may only have a small selection. But if you look up the information in this publication, you will know which ones that are going to be best for your home garden. The 4 that I've listed here, I usually will see a lot of those 4 in the garden centers and in nurseries. And these have all been proven to do really well in our area. This slide is going to give you an idea of what you can expect to harvest from mature plants that are grown under the very best conditions. So if you do everything right and your blueberries are mature, which is probably about 8 years old, you should be able to pick about 10 to 15 pounds of blueberries per bush. Your strawberries, you should be able to get about 1 to 2 pounds per plant. Your raspberries, if you plant them in a 10-foot row, and remember we talked about starting at 2 feet, you should get about 25 pounds. That's after a few years when they continue to fill out in that row. And for blackberries, 10 to 13 pounds per plant. And we're talking about the trailing blackberries. All right, now let's take a look at a few of the problems that you might have with your berry plants. Even though blueberries do have some disease and insect problems, most of these problems can be avoided if your plants have the proper pH and are pruned and fertilized every year, and if you have enough water during the growing season. Now, mummyberry can be reduced by picking off the infected berries. You can see that picture in the middle. You can tell which of those berries are affected by what we call mummyberry. If you pick those off and not let them fall to the ground, that's a good way to keep them coming back the following year. And if any of them do fall to the ground, you want to pick those up and get rid of them. So that's one way to help reduce. If you look through the publications on blueberries, you will find a lot more information. We also put out a 10-minute university webinar on blueberries, and you can look that up too. We will give you that information. You look that up and it has a lot more information about the different diseases and how to take care of those. Bacterial blight is one of the things you might see on your blueberries. The nice thing, I better not say that's nice because I am talking about a disease, but you will know if you have bacterial blight because it only happens on the new growth, that new season's growth, not on the old growth. Now for bird damage, all I can tell you is you're going to have to cover them with something, either build a structure and put bird netting or some type of wire around it in order to keep the birds out completely. We do have an insect called a spotted winged Drosophila, and you'll notice when I continue with this slideshow that I'm going to mention this little guy a lot. This is a fruit fly, but not a normal fruit fly like we're used to. These fruit flies do not wait until the berries are rotten before they decide to start eating on them or laying eggs in them. As your berries are ripening on your bush, the female will lay an egg inside of the berry. We do have spotted winged Drosophila traps that you can look up and find out how to make those, and that will help you keep those off of your berries. Now, the insects that you may find in your strawberries are root weevils, spotted winged Drosophila, fruit fly again, and of course, slugs. The spotted winged Drosophila traps can be set out to catch the fruit flies, but you'll have to do some scouting around in order to find the root weevils and the slugs. Being your berries have enough air circulation and keep up with the harvest can also help with botrytis. We call that fruit rot. Botrytis, a lot of times we just call it gray mold. So having enough air circulation. But remember, our strawberries are ripening at the time of year when we usually have a lot of rain. So that also can cause a lot of that gray mold. As far as the weather goes, a late frost can cause your strawberries to be deformed, but using a row cover or some other type of cover can help with that. Now, the most destructive problem we have for raspberries is called root rot. It's Phytophthora root rot, to be exact. This happens when the raspberries are planted in the area where they have a high water table and allows the roots to be much, much too wet. Growing on a raised bed or a raised mound can help with this problem. A crown borer is also one of the problems you may see on your raspberries. It looks like a yellow jacket, but it's actually a moth, and it bores into the lower canes or the crown of the raspberry plant. And if you have them, you're going to want to dig out the canes or the crown and burn them up. Excuse me. If your plant doesn't have enough leaves on it, you may get a little bit of sun scald. And once again, we have a 10-minute university webinar about raspberries. So if you look up that webinar, you'll be able to find out more information about the diseases and pests. Now, in my own garden, I would say that I have the least problems with my blackberries than I do with any of the other berries I grow. Some of the problems that I've seen on my blackberries, such as the red berry mite and rust, they only seem to happen once in a while. I don't seem to have that problem all year. Sometimes I'll have some leaf spots, but it doesn't seem to affect most of the leaf spots that I've had, at least on my blackberries, doesn't seem to affect the berries themselves. You can avoid winter damage by planting a variety that's less susceptible to cold. The trailing blackberries that I'm talking about mostly, those are more susceptible to cold than the semi-erect and the erect. So if you're living in a cold area, you might want to think about planting the other type of blackberries instead of the trailing blackberries. Now, sunshine is very important when we're talking about growing berries. The more sun, the sweeter the berries are going to be. If you do not have enough sun to grow berries, but you really, really want some, I would suggest that you plant blackberries. They will tolerate some shade and still taste really well and still produce a really good crop. But growing the others in a shaded area will not only make them less sweet, but they will also cause more disease and insect problems. So sunshine is the best idea. If you don't have one area that's completely full of sunshine, then you might think about planting your berries in containers, and you may have to just move them from one area to the next during the day. Now, here's a job that most of us are not very fond of, but I'm going to give you some ideas on how to best deal with weeding. Mulching blueberries with sawdust or bark is the best way to prevent the weeds from growing. And if you do have weeds, it's better to pull the weeds by hand to avoid tearing into the roots that grow really close to the soil surface. And be very careful if you're using any herbicides that are made for woody plants around your blueberry plants, because of course blueberries are a woody plant. Dense plantings of strawberries and mulching and hand pulling the weeds is the best way to control them in the strawberry patch. But be careful with the dense plantings, because remember I talked about botrytis, or what we call gray mold. And if you have your strawberry plants too densely planted, you might have a little bit of trouble with that. Using a mulch such as compost, hand weeding, or using a tool cultivation works well with raspberries and blackberries. Now, since trailing blackberries and semi-erect blackberries only grow from the crown, it would be pretty easy to take a weeding tool, and get in there between your berry plants to get the weeds out. But if you're doing it in a raspberry patch, be careful, because remember I said the raspberries grow, you start them in one spot, but they are going to grow from the roots and they are going to fill in that area. So if you're out there with some type of tool, cultivation tool, be careful that you're not going to be ripping out the new raspberries, because the new sprouts that are coming up are the ones that are going to produce next year's berries. Now, all berries are going to need some kind of fertilizing to produce the best berries. And with the following slides, what I mainly want you to realize is when and how often you'll need to fertilize. This might give you an idea of whether this berry is going to be the one that you're going to want to plant, or if it's going to take too much time. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of details. Once again, the publications that I mentioned from OSU will have specific information on when and how much to plant, to fertilize your plants with. So when we're talking about fertilizing strawberries, if you're planting June bears, the first year you're putting them in. So if you put them in this year, you're going to do 3 applications. So think about that. If you're not going to be home this summer, you might not want to put your strawberries in this year. You might want to wait, because you're really going to need 3 applications to get those strawberries going quickly. You're going to plant them 2 weeks. You're going to put the fertilizer on 2 weeks after planting, a month later, and then a month later. But if you have established plantings after the first year, you're only going to have to fertilize them once, and that is after they get done harvesting. That's the June bearers. Now, for the day neutrals, because they put on strawberries all during the growing season, you're going to give them a little bit of fertilizer all during the growing season. With strawberries, we suggest that you use a complete fertilizer. That doesn't mean you have to use a 16/16 like I wrote down here, but a complete fertilizer means it's a fertilizer that has nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium all in it. And there are a lot of synthetic and organic fertilizers that are complete fertilizers. And like I said before, please check those publications for more details. Now, fertilizing your caneberries, which are raspberries and blackberries, once again, you can see it almost looks exactly like the strawberries. Your planting year, you're going to use 3 applications, 2 weeks after planting, a month later, and another month after that. But once you have them established, they're only going to need 2 applications of fertilizer, one in late March to early April, the other one in late May to early June. And once again, use some type of complete fertilizer. If you are using an organic fertilizer, which is a wonderful thing to do, please remember that organic fertilizers take a lot longer to work than synthetic fertilizers do, or non-organic. So that way you're going to need to put them on earlier. So if something says to put it on late March or early April, start a month before that to put on your organic fertilizers. The information in the OSU publications do talk about organic fertilizers also. Now, blueberries will need to be fertilized 3 times a year. And because they need a low pH, blueberries need a much lower pH than the other berries, it will be more critical to know what type of fertilizers to use and what types not to use. So please do consult those OSU publications. So for blueberries, your new and established plants, both, you're going to be applying whatever it is you decide to use in late April, late May, or late June. Unless it's organic, you're going to start a little bit earlier. If you want to use a synthetic, ammonium sulfate or urea are recommended. And do you notice why there's something different about those two? And that's because they are not a complete fertilizer. They only have nitrogen. Blueberries really only need nitrogen fertilizer, and they need the ammonium type of nitrogen fertilizer, not the nitrate type. So for organics, blood meal and feather meal have the highest nitrogen amount. So those are good ones to use on your blueberries. Now, one of the concerns of new gardeners is how and when to prune their plants. That's a question we all have. And I will say it's not even just new gardeners. Us gardeners that have been gardening for a while still have a lot of questions about pruning. So pruning strawberries is probably the easiest to do and it's easiest to remember of all the berries. If you have summer bearing raspberries, you can do what is called renovation. That's after they are harvested. And to renovate them, you just need to cut off the leaves down to a few inches above the crown, and they will put out fresh new leaves and new runners for the following year. Then in late fall, you might want to just rake up or hand remove any of the dead leaves or any of the leftover berries. Try to get all those leftover berries out of there because those are going to bring in diseases and insects, and we don't want that. Now, for your day neutrals, you do not renovate them because remember, they are putting your strawberries on all season long, all during the growing season, all summer long. So you're just going to be cleaning them up a little bit in the fall. That's not too hard to do, is it? Now, pruning summer bearing raspberries is really quite simple. They do take annual pruning. You're going to remove the old canes in late summer or fall. And believe me, when you look at your raspberries, you're going to know which ones already produced the berries and which ones are going to be growing up new, the new primocanes that are growing up from the ground for the following year. You're going to be able to tell. So people always ask me, well, how I know which ones are new and which ones are old. Trust me, you look at your plants and you will be able to tell. And then around March, you're going to just top them to 6 feet, and that's all. Now, the fall bearing raspberries are a little bit different. If you're growing for your fall crop only, you can grow fall bearing raspberries. You can have 2 crops or you can have just 1 crop. And what a lot of people do is they plant summer bearing raspberries in 1 row and fall bearing raspberries in another row. They have summer bearing and then they only want to have 1 large crop in the fall. So if you want just 1 crop of your fall bearing raspberries, all you have to do is in March, cut them down to just a couple inches above the ground. And that's all. They'll grow up, they'll produce in the fall. Next March, you cut them down again. But if you're growing your fall bearing raspberries for 2 crops a year, the first year you plant them in the ground, they're going to produce their first crop in the fall. That's why we call them primocane fruiting raspberries, because they are going to produce their first crop on the primocanes at the top, the tips. So what you're going to do is after you harvest them in the fall, you're going to cut the tips off. Then following summer, they're going to produce their second crop. And remember, as they are producing their second crop, new ones are starting to grow up from the ground. So after they produce their second crop, you're going to just cut them down to the ground. I know that might be a little confusing now. We have a lot of publications on how to prune raspberries. So for more information and to be able to read about it and really understand it, it took me several years, believe it or not, to figure out this system. So I read a lot and finally figured it out. So I would suggest you do the same. Now, for blackberries, you want to have annual pruning. You want to remove the old canes in September, and then you're going to attach the new canes that grew during that summer to the wires. But remember that with the exception of a few thornless varieties, most blackberries do have thorns, so pruning can be a little hazardous unless you are definitely dressed properly and have pruning gloves on. By following these simple rules of pruning blueberries, your blueberries should produce a strong new wood and maintain good fruit production. So prune them anywhere from January to early March. You're going to remove dead and diseased branches, weak branches that are shorter than your knees. You're going to remove some of the branches that would touch the ground. In other words, really small ones that would touch the ground when they were full of berries. You're going to cut out some of the old unproductive canes, cut down the twiggy wood at the top of the plant, and thin out to allow light. The blueberry webinar that I mentioned has more detail about pruning blueberries. Now, what else do you need to know? Are you wondering if you're going to need to build some kind of structure for your berries? Well, the only berries that are going to need to have some kind of support built in is raspberries and blackberries. There are a lot of lots of information out there about the different types of supports to use. So whatever support you find, make sure that it works best for you. It doesn't have to be one that OSU says this is the perfect way to do a support. If it doesn't work for you, find a different way to trellis your raspberries or your blackberries. You'll know what works best for you. Now, I'm going to tell you about a few things that you may not know about berry plants. So here's some things you may not know about blueberries. Blueberries are self-fertile. You can have one single plant and you will get berries. But if you have more than one variety or more than one cultivar, you will get not only more berries on those bushes, you will get bigger berries too. Amending the soil, in other words, working into the soil as you're planting with compost and manure is not recommended. And that is because compost and manure can have a very high pH and can have very high salt, which blueberries do not like. And did you know that the berry buds are set in August? A lot of us, after we harvest our blueberries, we might forget about watering them. That's one of the most important times to water your blueberries, because if you don't water them at the end of the season, they're not going to set very many berry buds for the next year. Here's some things you may not know about strawberries. You don't want to replant your daughter plants to another area. If you've grown your strawberries for about 3-4 years and they're getting a little bit less, and you think, oh, I'm just going to pull up those daughter plants and I'm going to plant them in another area, not a good idea. Because after a few years, strawberries can get a lot of viruses and there may be a lot of insects. And you don't want to, if the mother plant has that, the daughter plant's going to have that problem too. So you don't want to take your daughter plants. You want to buy new disease-free, certified disease-free plants from a local nursery or farm store. When you're planting your strawberries, if you're planting them, don't bend the roots. They do not like having their roots bent. If you end up purchasing bare root, you're going to find that some of the roots are really long. So instead of bending the roots to get them in the hole, cut them just a little bit shorter so that they fit into the hole nicely. And you're going to cut off the runners of all your day neutral varieties. And I did mention that. We want them to produce strawberries during the growing season, not babies. And did you know that Umpqua ice cream only uses hood strawberries in their ice cream? That's what I grow, and that's why I grow them. Now, you may not know that raspberries are not very well behaved. Okay, sure, you have a row of raspberries, you planted them, and you think they're going to grow right in this row. No, they're not. They're going to grow wherever they want to grow. Remember, they come from the roots. Their roots can go out 6 inches, 12 inches, couple feet. They're going to grow where you don't want them. Sorry about that, but they're not very well behaved. You're the one that's going to have to make them behave. Phytophthora root rot is the biggest problem. And I did mention that before, so I guess you already know this. But there are new resistant cultivars available. Cascade Bounty is one, but there is definitely a list. And I guess you already do know that fall-bearing raspberries also come in very yummy yellow. Here's some things you may not know about blackberries. Marionberries are the most popular berries that are sold. Thornless blackberries are available. And yes, you know now that Logan, Boysen, and Taze are all a cross between a blackberry and a raspberry. The trailing and semi-erect blackberries are very well behaved because they only grow from the crown, but the erect blackberries grow from the crown and from roots, so they're not quite as well behaved. Now, here's some of the more frequently asked questions I get from people when I'm talking about berries. Do I need to prune my blueberries every year? Yes, annual pruning is needed to encourage new growth. Blueberries grow best on 1 to 5 year old wood. If you don't prune them every year, the wood's going to get older and older and older, and your blueberries will get smaller. How can I keep the birds away? Well, try everything you can. Enclosed netting or wire is really the only sure way to keep them away, but you can try scare devices, you can try blow up devices, anything you can to keep them away. When is the best time to move my blueberries? Fall is actually the best time, October, November, and they do transplant very well. But if you really have to move them, you can move them in spring. And if for some reason you're moving in the middle of summer to a new home and you want to take your blueberry plant with you, go ahead, dig it up, put it in a container and move it. Why do my vines die in the summer and then look good again the next year? That is a sure sign that you have Phytophthora root rot. It takes a lot of energy to produce berries. And if the roots are rotted, the canes can't take up water and nutrients, so they die. But the new primocanes that are starting to grow, they don't need as much. So they grow fine until they start to produce the berries. And then when they start to produce the berries, they die too. So that's a good indication that you have Phytophthora root rot. It's time to get rid of those, find a new area, plant them on a raised bed and start all over again. Okay, how can I keep my raspberries in an area that I want them to stay? All I can say is good luck. They're not well behaved, so you're just going to have to pull up or cut down the ones you don't want. And how do I trellis my blackberries? Well, blackberries usually, like this picture shows, usually have 2 horizontal wires, and the canes are brought together from the crown and wound around the wires. But then again, if that doesn't work for you, don't worry about it. I have a friend who has blackberries planted on a hoop house, and they grow up the wire, come down the other side. She goes inside of the hoops and picks the berries. It works perfectly for her. Can I put my strawberries in a hanging basket or a container? Oh, definitely, yes. Day neutrals, definitely plant day neutrals because they're growing strawberries all year, all summer, and all growing season. So I would plant day neutrals if you're going to put them in a hanging basket or a container. I have been told to rotate my crop. Is that really necessary? Yes, if possible, it will help with disease and insect problems. So if possible, and you have another area that you can plant your strawberries in, let them grow there for 3 or 4 years, and then replant them to the next areas, you'll have better luck with your strawberries and less disease and insect problems. Well, that's the end of this slide production. Some of you have written in questions and my co-host will read some of them now and I will do the best I can to answer them. So Cheryl, are you there with some questions?
I certainly am. I've got to tell you, you're making me hungry for berry season.
Me too.
Can't wait. We do have some great questions. One person wants to know if they can put 2 half-high bushes in a whiskey barrel.
I would say probably not. I would definitely put just one. And the bigger the barrel, the more area that you're going to have for the roots and the bigger the bush. Even though it's a half high, it won't get as big as a northern high bush, but it will get bigger.
Thank you.
Sorry, find another one.
I'm hoping
2 whiskey barrels.
Right, 2, yeah, that's right, a 2 whiskey barrel thing. This individual is hoping to plant a variety of berries in the garden, but the area that she's thinking of floods in the wintertime. Are there any berries that you think would do well in that environment?
Blackberries don't have quite as much problem with that, but if it really, really does flood, no berries grow in flooded areas. But if they want to, they can try to plant them on a big mound so that maybe the flooded area won't reach the mounded part to where the roots are, or try to put in some type of French drain. I know that's going to be expensive, but somehow try to get that area not to flood. That's the best I can say.
Okay. This individual wants to know if they need to plant at least 2 bushes of blueberries or raspberries for cross-pollination, or can these plants self-pollinate?
They do self-pollinate, and for raspberries, that's fine, no problem. The raspberries will continue to grow, put out more, and there won't be a problem with just one variety. With the blueberries, if you have more than one variety, you will get more berries and larger berries. So with those, I would suggest maybe you get 2, one your favorite variety and one your second favorite variety. For raspberries, it doesn't matter at all.
Jane, is there a favorite day neutral strawberry variety that people like to plant? Are you aware of a particular one that does well?
We're not allowed as master gardeners to specifically tell people, but I can tell you that me and my friends that I have talked to really love Seascape and Albion. Those are the larger of the day neutrals. Now, I'm not saying that as a master gardener. I'm just saying that as my own personal. And TriStar are a little smaller, but they seem to be a little bit sweeter. That's what people tell me. But having said that, the more sun they get, the sweeter they're going to be. So somebody might have Seascape in a little bit area that's shaded and another variety in the area that's sunner, and they may end up being sweeter or better tasting than the ones that I like the best.
Great answer. Now we have a couple people who are trying to identify strawberries that are already in the ground. Either they've moved there and they don't know if they're June bearing or ever bearing. Is there a way to identify a strawberry variety once it's already in the ground?
Look, if they put out a lot of runners, they're probably a June bearer. And you'll know it's a June bearer because they will put out a big flush of berries around June, and then they won't put on any more. Now, everbearing, I didn't really talk about everbearing varieties. We don't find everbearers very much anymore because they only put on 2 small crops. That's why day neutrals has kind of taken over that, because they will put on a crop all during the growing season. So if it puts on crop all during the growing season, you know that you have day neutral. If you have a little bit in the summer in June and you have a little bit more towards the end of summer, then you can probably figure you have a everbearer. And why they call them everbearer when they don't ever bear, they only bear twice, I don't know, but that's what they call them.
Are there any specific ID or ways to ID a day neutral strawberry? This individual's daughter has them and they're not sure what variety they are and they're already in the ground.
You mean specific variety of the day neutrals?
Correct.
I do not. I would imagine you would have to people would have to taste them to know, people that really know their strawberries by the different tastes. I hope there's someplace out there that has a lot of different varieties that she could go taste.
Someone gave this individual raspberries. They dug up and they were gifted raspberries, and they planted them in the fall, and now they're starting to sprout. So they wanted, should I let them grow and then see what they produce? And they assume no pruning this year.
Okay, she planted them in the fall, so they're starting to grow now. That's fine. Then just let them grow and see what they produce. So if she got them from her friend, I'm hoping that the friend didn't have any problems with her and she's not spreading diseases to her other friend. But I suppose she probably knows what variety they are. So she probably knows whether they're summer bearing or fall bearing. So she probably already figured that out. And then she can look up the information and know how to prune them after they produce.
My blackberries have worms in them. How can I prevent this?
Okay. Since they're worms, they're probably maggots and not worms. And they're probably from the spotted wing Drosophila. So what they need to do is look up, well, if they get I was going to say, look up the information, but I would go ahead and put out some spotted wing Drosophila traps, look up that information on how to build one. Very easy, just with a cup and some apple cider vinegar. Very simple traps. Put those out before your berries are ripe. And then as the berries ripen, make sure that that is what the problem is and is not something else. Usually that's what it is. People think they're worms, but they're actually little white, I know this sounds gross, they're little white wiggly maggots because it is a fly. Sorry.
It's part of life, right? It's part
now, do you want to eat those berries, Cheryl, or not?
No, I will pass. We've had a couple of questions about planting companion plants near berries to help control pests.
As long as the pH for the plant and the companion plant match, a lot of people want to plant something underneath their blueberry bushes, but what they plant there needs a high pH and the blueberry needs a low pH. So if the pH matches, you can try for the companion planting. I know that's something that is getting a lot more attention now. So you want to give it a try. I say go for it.
This is kind of related to that, and I'm going to guess I know your answer. I saw recommended to grow strawberries under blueberries. Wouldn't moving them in 3 to 4 years later be disruptive to blueberry roots?
Well, the worst thing is that blueberries take a 4.5 to 5.5 pH, and strawberries take anywhere from like 6 to 6.5. Not a good idea to put strawberries under blueberries, and I have seen a lot of people do it. Looks pretty, but then neither one of them grow very well.
And another question about ground cover. This individual wants to know about a good ground cover for around raspberries.
Well, I would not suggest you put a ground cover under raspberries, because your ground cover is going to take up nutrients and water too. And remember, raspberries are going to come up from the roots. They're going to need nutrients. So I would suggest you put them to some type of mulch instead of a ground cover.
Okay, good answer. Do thorns keep deer away? What berry is the least favorite of the deer?
I don't know. I have had them eat all of mine. I've had them eat all of mine. So
it's a tough one. I think the only thing
I like all the berries. Why don't they like all the berries too?
Right. It seems only fair that they get to enjoy the berries too. Yeah. It says, why no compost on blueberries?
You can use a little bit of compost as a mulch, only a little bit, maybe an inch to an inch and a half. But you don't want to add that into the soil as an amendment, because it has a high pH and blueberries need a low pH. But if you want to use it as a mulch, you can put a little bit on and then put more sawdust or bark on top of that.
How do I protect my strawberries from pill bugs?
From pill bugs. The thing is, people don't realize this. They think the pill bugs are the ones that are starting the problem. Mm-hmm. They are actually what do you call them, Cheryl?
They're decomposers. And
decomposer. Thank you. Mm-hmm. If something is wrong with the strawberry to begin with, it's got squished or it has a mark on it or something, they are going to come in to clean it up. So in other words, if you have pill bugs in your strawberries, something else is either bothering your strawberries to begin with, or you're not picking them soon enough after they're, harvesting them well enough. So that's what pill bugs do.
My berries are on a drip system. How many days a week? How long should they be watered? And I know it just really depends on where, how much sun.
It definitely does. There's a lot of information out there about drip irrigation and how much certain plants need for it. So I would definitely say to find that information on drip and then go from there. But once you have drip irrigation, you also are going to need to check it every once in a while. You're going to need to dig down 6 to 12 inches, depending on what type of berry you have, and find out if the water that you're using is actually going into the root system, into the area where the roots are. So even though you have it on drip, you're still going to need to check it quite often.
Do you know anything about wild white strawberries? This is not something I've heard anything about, so I thought maybe you might, but wild white strawberries.
I know there's a wild strawberry out there that are little tiny pink ones I have seen. I do not recall, but something to look up.
Do you have a berry that you would recommend as an edible hedge?
Depends on how thick you want the hedge to be. Now, raspberries, if you let a lot of the roots grow up, you let a lot of the primocanes grow up, it can make more of a screen. Your blackberries aren't going to make such an amount of a screen. Your Blueberries, if you plant them together, will make a screen, but they're also going to lose their leaves. Maybe I would suggest a native berry, like a huckleberry. Those stay evergreen all year. Maybe you want to not have, how about Oregon grape? You can use the Oregon grapes. They are food. They make great jellies and jams.
They're great for wildlife too.
Yes, yes.
So
Something that's evergreen. So I would look up different types of evergreen berries. You're probably going to end up getting an odd variety or a native variety.
Right.
And that's a good idea.
And the huckleberry,
great idea.
It is a great idea. And I've got huckleberries that I've used on my yard too, as a couple shrubs. They're evergreen. And the birds love them. They're a good advantage to my yard. All right. So I have personal experience on this question. This individual wants to know if they leave a salt or a feed block out for the deer near your berries or fruit, will that keep them from eating your fruit? I can tell you from personal experience that does not work. In fact, that brings more of them to you. So you probably don't want to do that. It's a great question though, because it does seem like if you gave them some food over there, they could leave your stuff alone. Doesn't work. Would growing wood,
after eating a little bit of salt, you kind of want to go over and have a nice sweet berry, don't you?
Yeah, I would want it. Are there risks of bringing in pests with certain kinds of mulches? They're thinking about using, some of the chips that are dropped, got chips, but they just basically give you chips from wherever they've been grinding up chips or taking down trees.
Some of the newest information about mulches say that even if a tree has a disease and then it's cut up as a mulch, that the mulch is not going to be able to keep that disease. There's a lot of new information out there about that. So I would say probably not, but I would definitely I would think about it before and find out if you can tell where the mulch came from, where the yard debris came from. But for most of the time, they say it's not going to be a problem.
This individual would like some clarification between mulch and compost.
Okay, compost can be used as a mulch. Okay, compost is a type of mulch. Sawdust is a type of mulch. Yard debris is a type of mulch. Now, there's a difference between mulch and amendment, and that might be where they're getting a little confused. Amendment is something that you add to your native soil and work it in. That's an amendment. Mulch is just something you put on top of the soil. Does that make enough sense to you, Cheryl?
That sounds like a great answer, Jane. Do you know about pine berries? This is not something that I know a great deal about, so I can't answer whether or not they get cared for like day neutral or June bearing strawberries. I don't know about pine berries.
I'm afraid I don't either. I'm sorry.
Sorry, wait. Would growing woody plants like huckleberries, currants, and elderberries fare better in a raised bed, or can they be planted near each other to help pollination? In a raised bed, of course, we've got the temperature advantage, probably better drainage, and so forth. And pollination?
Well, pollinators will go from, it depends on what it is that's pollinating them. Bees, honeybees, mason bees, they'll fly quite a long way. And so will a lot of other little wasp pollinators and things like that. Yours are probably planted not on raised beds, are they, Cheryl? My no. Huckleberries and things are not planted on raised beds, and they do fine.
Right.
So I would say it's mainly your own preference of what she or he wants to do.
Right. If you want them up high, for a high, particularly for strawberries, if you want your barberries to be a little higher, so you don't have to bend over quite so far. But yeah, my other things are all planted in the ground. And lots of people use straw under strawberries. That's a normal practice that works well. They're a little bit worried about spreading weeds since they don't always know where the straw comes from.
Right. You definitely don't want to use hay because there's seeds in that. And sometimes straw does end up having some seeds in it. So sometimes, but if it's thick enough, it might suppress a few of the weeds, even though it brought in the weeds itself. That's all I can say.
Last question. I've been finding large maggots on or in my blueberries. So they're about 1/4 inch long, and they are not Drosophila.
Really?
Yeah, that's what I wondered too.
Okay, I don't know how they know they're not Drosophila unless they've had them looked at by an entomologist that actually knows their larva and which is which. I would say next year, to me, it would seem like they probably would be Drosophila, but I mean, if they're white and they're only about 1/4 of an inch, that might be.
Yep.
I would try to rear some out next year. Put some in a little container with a little bit of air circulation and see if you can rear them out. Because if this person finds out that they are not Drosophila and they are some other type of whatever fly has laid eggs inside of the berry, then they're going to need a different system in order to take care of it. So I would try this year to let them grow and see what happens.
See what
See
develops.
what they find.
Yeah, see what develops. Sometimes you have to let things take their little course so you can figure out what they are.
Yes.
All right. Great job, Jane. Wonderful presentation. I can't wait for berry season.
Well, thank you. I hope everyone got information out of it. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.